You were a burden I never asked for. Iselle.
Uncle, please! I'll leave the village, I swear!
The laws forbid it, but the oaks are screaming.
Vixara!
Why?
Because the oaks were screaming.
The first shovelful of earth landed on her chest with a weight she had not expected. It was heavier than rain. It was heavier than snow. It came down in a single dense thud that pressed the breath out of her lungs and tasted, somehow, of iron in the back of her throat. She tried to scream. The cloth her uncle had stuffed into her mouth took the scream and made it small. She tried to lift her hands. Her hands were tied at the wrists, and the wrists were tied to her hips, and her hips were inside a pit her uncle had dug while she was unconscious. And the pit was deep enough that the rim of it was already above her shoulders when she opened her eyes. The second shovelful struck her hip and the side of her face. She turned her head violently and felt grit slip into the corner of her eye. She blinked it out. Above her, through the open mouth of the grave, she could see her uncle's silhouette against the cold grey of the dawn sky. He was not looking at her. He had not looked at her since he had pushed her into the hole. Her name was Iselle Calder. She was 19 years old. Her parents had been dead for 4 years, 3 months, and 11 days, and she had counted every one of those days, because the man standing above her while with a shovel had never once let her forget that she was a burden he had not asked for. Now he was burying her. He worked the way he did everything, with the steady, unhurried rhythm of a man who had already decided. Lift, tip, lift, tip. The dirt came down in pulses. It covered her stomach. It covered her arms. She could feel the cold pressure of it climbing her body, and she understood, with a clarity that was somehow worse than panic, that she had perhaps 3 more minutes before her chest would not be able to rise against the weight at all. She thought of her mother's hands, which had braided her hair on Sunday mornings. She thought of her father, who had called her little bird, because she had been small at birth and noisy from the first moment. She thought of the cottage on the south edge of the village, the cottage with the apple tree and the slate roof her father had laid himself, and she understood, finally, why her uncle had been so patient with her these last 4 years. He had been waiting for her 20th birthday. The cottage came to her on her 20th birthday. If she died before, it went to him. He had waited until the morning of the last full week. She was crying. She had not realized she was crying. The tears made hot tracks through the grit on her face. Her uncle worked above her, and she watched his face in the brightening light. And she understood that he had not even drunk anything to do this. He was sober. He had walked her out into the deep wood at first light, told her they were going to gather mushrooms. And the last thing she remembered before the hole was the wet, dull sound of the shovel meeting the back of her skull. Now her shoulders were buried, now her chin. He paused. For a moment she thought he was going to look at her. He did not. He looked instead at the trees around the clearing, the dense, black, ancient trees of the old wood. The wood the villagers did not enter, the wood that lay 3 miles past the last road. He looked at them as though he were checking that they were watching, as though he wanted them to know that he was not afraid. Then he tipped the last load of dirt over her face. The world went black and wet and full of the smell of root and cold, and the iron taste of her own blood, where she had bitten through her lip. She heard him stamp the earth flat above her. She heard the dull thud of his boots 3, 4, 5 times. She heard him turn. She heard the careful, deliberate sound of him walking away. Not running, not hurrying, just walking, the way a man walks home from work. and then she heard nothing at all except the impossible, suffocating noise of soil pressing against her ears. She had perhaps a minute now, maybe less. She did not think about God. She thought about the apple tree. The wood above her was not silent. It had only seemed silent to the man who had walked away. 3 trees back from the edge of the clearing, in the deep green black of the moss-clad oaks, a figure that was not a man stood with his hand resting against a trunk and watched the spot where the earth had been freshly turned. He had been there since before the digging began. He had been there since before Iselle Calder had been carried into the clearing, slung over her uncle's shoulder like a sack of grain. He had stood in stillness, and he had watched, and he had not moved. Because the laws of his kind were old, and one of the oldest of those laws said that the affairs of mortals were the affairs of mortals, and the people of the wood did not interfere. His name, as much as he had one in any tongue a mortal could speak, was Theoryn. He was the warden of this stretch of forest. He had watched men kill each other under his trees for 900 years. He had not stepped from behind a single tree to stop a single one of them, but he had been watching her since she was 12. He had not meant to watch her. She had wandered into the edge of the wood that summer with a basket and no shoes, looking for the kind of mushroom that only grew under birch, and she had stopped at the boundary of the deep wood and put her hand against the trunk of an old oak and said aloud, "To nobody, I'm sorry to disturb you." The oak had told him. The oaks of the old wood spoke to him when something mattered. He had been curious. He had followed her, unseen, through that summer and the next. He had watched her bury her mother and her father in the same week. He had watched her grow thin in her uncle's house. He had watched her bring sugar to the wood every winter and leave it on the moss, even though no one had taught her to do that, and no one in her village remembered that anyone ever had. He had watched her keep treating small things with care. Now the oaks were screaming. He stepped out from behind the tree. The clearing was empty of human sound. The man with the shovel had been gone for nearly a minute. The earth where she lay was already still. He crossed the moss in 3 strides and knelt at the head of the grave. And he did not bother with the shovel that her uncle had thrown into the bushes. He pressed his palm flat against the dirt above where her face would be, and he spoke a single word in the language the trees had given him, and the earth opened the way a mouth opens. He pulled her up by the front of her dress. Her face was packed with soil. Her lips were blue. He turned her sideways, struck her between the shoulder blades twice, hard, and watched her cough out a thick, dark plug of dirt and saliva and blood. She drew breath. It was the worst sound he had heard in 900 years. It was a sound he would not forget. She did not see him. Her eyes were closed. She was not yet anywhere. He lifted her. She weighed almost nothing. And he carried her, and the wood opened for him as it had always opened for him, and the place where the man's grave had been was already, by the time they reached the edge of the clearing, beginning to soften back into ordinary forest floor. She woke in a place she did not know. She did not open her eyes for a long time. Her eyes felt full of grit, and her throat felt as though it had been scraped with a stone. And the first sense to return was smell, the smell of crushed mint, and something colder and greener, and wood smoke from a small clear fire. When she finally opened her eyes, she was lying on a bed of moss inside a ring of standing stones. The stones were taller than she was. They were rough and grey-green with lichen. Above her, the canopy of the forest closed almost completely, but a single shaft of late morning light came down through a gap between 2 pines and fell across her hands. Her hands were free. The ropes were gone. She did not see them anywhere. Her wrists were red and raw, but the rope itself was not in the clearing. She tried to sit up and the world rolled sideways. She fell back. She lay still and breathed, and she felt the soil that was still in her hair and in her ears and packed into the creases of her elbows, and she understood, slowly, the way a person understands a thing in a dream, that she was alive. She did not understand why. There was a wooden bowl beside her. The bowl was carved from a single piece of pale wood, and it held water so clear that she could see her own face shaking in it. She drank. She had never tasted water like it. It was cold in the way that snow is cold, and clean in the way that nothing in her uncle's house had ever been clean. And she drank it all in one slow swallow, and felt it move down into her chest and settle there like a small, steady light. Across the clearing, on the moss between two of the standing stones, she saw him. He was sitting with his back against one of the stones, and his hands resting on his knees. And at first her mind tried to call him a man, and then her mind gave up. His skin was the pale colour of birch in winter. His hair was very long and very dark and damp. His ears came to a fine point above the line of his jaw. There were wings folded behind him, not the bright wings of any story she had been told as a child, but slow, heavy wings of black-blue feather, edged in something that caught the light like wet ink. He was looking at her with an expression she could not read. She tried to speak. The first sound she made was a cough, and the cough became a wet, retching noise as more dirt came up out of her throat. He waited. When she could finally speak, the only word she had was the wrong one. Why? He did not answer for a long moment. When he did, his voice was quieter than she had expected. It was the voice of someone who did not often need to use it. Because the oaks were screaming, he said. She slept again. She did not know for how long. When she woke the second time, the light through the canopy had shifted, and the small fire had burned down to a soft red eye. And he was no longer sitting where he had been. He was standing at the far edge of the stone circle with his back to her, looking out into the trees. The wings were folded close to his body. From behind he looked almost like a man, if a man could be that tall and that still. She sat up. This time the world did not roll. Where am I? He did not turn. Inside the wood. Whose wood? Mine. She pulled her knees up under her chin. The dress she was wearing was the same dress she had worn into the forest, but the dirt was gone from it, and the tear at the shoulder where her uncle had grabbed her had been mended with a thread that was almost the colour of the cloth but not quite. The mend was very fine. She did not know whose hand had done it. I have to go back, she said. Her voice was not steady. He's going to tell them I ran. He's going to take the house. He turned then. He looked at her across the clearing with the long, pale face and the eyes that did not blink as often as eyes were supposed to. Where would you go? Home? You do not have a home. She did not know what to say to that. He was not being cruel. He was telling her the shape of a fact. She stood up. She had to put her hand against the nearest standing stone to do it, and the stone was warm under her palm, in a way that stone should not be. And she pulled her hand back fast and stared at. I have a cottage, she said, south of the village, on the river. You have a man who would put you in the ground a second time the moment he saw you. She wanted to argue. She could not. He thinks I'm dead, she tried. He knows you were buried alive, he said. He did not check that you stayed buried. If you walk back into the village, he will know within the hour, and he will not make the same mistake twice. She sat down on the moss because her legs would not hold her any longer. The light through the canopy moved across her face, and she watched a small green beetle climb the side of her shoe, and she did not say anything for a long time. Who are you? She said finally. Theoryn. That's not what I asked. He almost smiled. It moved one corner of his mouth and stopped. I am the warden of this wood. I keep its boundaries. I am not a man. I worked that out. Then you have worked out the part that matters. She looked at him. Why did you save me? He was silent for a long time. When he answered, he did not look at her. He looked at the trunk of one of the oaks beyond the circle. It was not permitted, he said. I have broken a law that is older than any king your people have ever had. I will answer for it. Then why? I have been watching you since you were 12 years old, he said. You said sorry to an oak tree. I have not heard one of your kind say sorry to a tree in 400 years. She did not know what to do with that. She put her face in her hands. When she lifted her head, he was kneeling in front of her. He had moved across the clearing without sound. He held something in his palm, a small piece of bread, dark and dense, and a single red berry on top of it. Eat, he said slowly. She took the bread. He stood and stepped back. She ate it. It was the best thing she had ever tasted, and the worst, because it tasted like her childhood, and she could not have said why. The bread sat warm in her stomach. The shaking in her hands slowed. She watched him pace the inside edge of the stone circle the way a wolf paces a perimeter, and she understood that he was not pacing for her sake. He was waiting for something. What happens now? She said. Now you stay. For how long? Until I have answered for what I did. And then he stopped pacing. He turned and looked at her, and his face in that moment was not the face of something 900 years old. It was the face of someone who did not yet know the answer to a question he had been asked. That, he said, depends on you. A sound came from the trees beyond the circle. It was not a sound she had ever heard. A thin, high, glassy chiming like wind across the rim of a clay bowl. Theoryn's head turned sharply toward it. The chiming came again closer. "What is that?" she whispered. "A herald," he said. "Stay inside the stones." She stayed inside the stones. Something moved at the edge of the clearing. She did not see it walk in. It was simply not there, and then it was there. A figure that was almost a tall, thin woman, almost a heron, almost neither, with long silver hair that fell to the moss and eyes the color of a frozen pond. Where Theoryn's wings were dark, hers were white and folded so tightly to her back that they almost vanished. She did not look at Iselle. She looked at Theoryn. She spoke. The words were not in any language Iselle had ever heard, but they had a weight that made the standing stones hum faintly under her palms. Theoryn answered her in the same language. His voice was very quiet. The herald spoke again. This time, partway through, her eyes did move, and they moved to Iselle, and they held there for one cold second. And Iselle felt the inside of her chest go very still. Theoryn answered. He did not raise his voice. But when he was done, the herald inclined her head, once slowly, and turned, and was gone the way she had come, which was no way at all. He stood for a long moment looking at the place where she had been. "What did she say?" Iselle asked. "She said the council has heard," he said. "She said I am summoned. She said the mortal cannot stay, but she cannot leave either, because the wood now knows her. She said a price will be set, and I will pay it." "What price?" "I do not know yet." He turned and looked at her. He looked tired in a way she had not seen on him before. He crossed the clearing and sat down on the moss beside her. Not close, but not far. He looked at his own hands. "I am sorry," he said. "For what?" "For saving you in a way that has tangled you in a law you did not ask for." She thought about this. She thought about the cold of the earth in her ears. She thought about her uncle's silhouette against the dawn sky. "You can be sorry tomorrow," she said. "Today I would rather be tangled than buried." He looked at her sideways. The corner of his mouth moved again. "You have a strange way of speaking," he said. "You're the one with feathers." He laughed. It was a startled, brief sound, as though he had not made that sound in a long time, and did not quite know what to do with it. She watched his face change. She watched him stop watching her like a strange animal, and start watching her like a person. It was the first time in 4 years that someone had looked at her and not looked away. The village was 3 miles south, on the slow brown bend of a river that fed eventually into the sea, and in the middle of the afternoon, Bram Calder walked back into it, carrying his shovel over his shoulder, and his face arranged in the careful, hollow way of a man with bad news. He went first to the smithy. He told the smith that Iselle was gone. He told it the way a man tells a thing he has been afraid would happen, with his eyes on the floor and his hand passing across his mouth. She had been speaking lately, he said, of a tinker who had come through in the spring. She had been restless. He had woken that morning, and her bed had been made, and her good shawl had been missing from its peg, and the back door had been ajar. The smith was a quiet man and did not ask too many questions. He said he was sorry. He said the girl had always been quiet. He said sometimes that kind ran. Bram went next to the priest. He told the priest the same thing. The priest was a young man who had not been long in the parish and did not know Iselle well, and he made a soft, sympathetic sound and said he would mention her in the prayers on Sunday. He went last to Anwen. Anwen Marrow was 61 years old, and she had been the village herbalist since before Bram Calder had a beard. And she had known Iselle's mother from the day Iselle's mother had been born. She had stood at Iselle's birth. She had pressed the first spoonful of honey water between Iselle's lips. She had washed and laid out Iselle's parents in the same week 4 years ago, with her own hands. She listened to Bram's story standing at her kitchen table. She did not interrupt. She did not offer condolences. When he finished, she looked at him for a long time across the table, across the bundles of drying yarrow and the small dark pot of something steeping, and she said only, "When?" "This morning," he said. "Before dawn, the door, what was she wearing?" He hesitated. The hesitation was very small. Her good shawl, the grey one. She did not own a grey shawl, Anwen said. She had a brown one her mother wove. There has never been a grey shawl in that house. Bram's face did not change. He had expected the question or one like it. The brown one, then. I misspoke. Yes, said Anwen. You did. He left a house faster than he had meant to. He did not look back. Anwen watched him from her doorway until he had turned the corner of the lane, and then she went back inside and sat down at her table and did not move for a long while. She did not weep. She had not wept since her husband died. She put both hands flat on the table, and she said aloud to her empty kitchen, Old wood. Old wood, if you have her, keep her. The wind shifted in the apple tree outside her window. Far to the north, beyond the last road, the great oaks of the old wood moved once, all together, in a wind that was not blowing anywhere else. The first night in the wood was the longest night of her life. He did not stay inside the stone circle with her. He sat outside it, his back against one of the stones, the dark wings folded around him like a cloak, and he did not sleep, at least, not in any way she could see. Every time she woke from her own fitful, shallow rest, his eyes were open. He was looking at the trees. She did not ask what he was watching for. She thought she already knew. She slept again toward morning and dreamed of the apple tree behind her parents' cottage. In the dream, she was small. Her father was lifting her up to reach a low apple. The apple in her hand was warm. She woke before she bit into it. When she opened her eyes, there was a creature sitting on her chest. It was no larger than a kitten. It had the soft pale fur of a fawn and the small clever face of a fox, and where its ears should have been there were two tiny tufts of pale green moss. It looked at her with eyes the colour of honey, and it tilted its head, and it made a sound that was almost a purr and almost a question. She did not move. She did not breathe. The creature reached out one small paw and patted her cheek very gently twice. Then it stood up, walked down the length of her body as though she were a bridge, jumped lightly onto the moss, and trotted off into the trees with its tail held high. She lay there for a long moment, with her hand against her cheek where the small paw had touched her. Then, for the first time since the shovel had struck her at dawn the day before, she laughed. It was a small, broken, surprised laugh. It came out of her like water from a stone. She put both hands over her mouth, because the laughing felt as though it might turn into something else if she let it run, and she sat up with her hands still pressed to her face and looked across the clearing. Theoryn was watching her. The expression on his face was the same one he had worn when she had said, "You're the one with feathers." "What was that?" she said. "A woodcat," he said. "They are very rare. They only come to people the wood likes." "What does the wood do with people it doesn't like?" He looked at her for a moment. "They do not stay long." She laughed again. It was a slightly steadier sound this time. He did not laugh with her, but the corner of his mouth moved, and she watched it move, and she filed the movement away like a small, valuable thing she would want to look at again later. He was gone for most of the second day. He told her he had been summoned, and that he had to go and answer, and that the stone circle would hold while he was away. The wood would not let anything pass into it that meant her harm. She believed him because she had no other choice, and because the moss under her was warm, even when there was no sun on it, and because the small wood cat came back twice during the day and lay across her feet without explaining itself. She used the time to think. She thought about the cottage on the south edge of the village. She thought about the apple tree. She thought about Anwen, who would know. Anwen had to know that her uncle was lying. She thought about the priest, who would not. She thought about the smith and the baker's wife, and the boys who used to throw acorns at her in the lane when she was 12. And she understood that even if she went back, even if she somehow got past her uncle, she would never be the girl she had been the morning before. She had been buried. Something in her had not come back up out of the dirt. She did not know yet what had stayed down there. She only knew that the cold of it had changed her. When the light began to slant gold through the canopy, she heard the trees move. The oaks beyond the circle leaned very slightly, all in the same direction, as though listening. The small woodcat sitting on her feet went still. A second sound came after the leaning of the trees. It was a sound she knew. It was the sound of a man walking through dry leaves, who did not care who heard him. She stood up. The woodcat vanished into the moss. She walked to the edge of the stone circle and put her hand against the nearest stone, and the stone was warm again, and through the trees she saw him. Her uncle was carrying a torch and an axe. He had come back to be sure. He did not see her at first. He walked into the clearing, the same clearing where, the day before, he had stamped the earth flat above her face, and he stopped. The ground there was no longer fresh. It was no longer turned. It was covered, instead, in small, white five-petaled flowers. Flowers that had not been there yesterday. Flowers that grew nowhere else in the wood, and the flowers covered the place where her grave had been from edge to edge. He stood very still and looked down at the flowers. She watched his shoulders. She saw the moment he understood. She saw him take one step back, and then another, and she saw the hand that held the torch begin, very slightly, to shake. He did not cross himself. He had never been a man for that. He raised the torch. "Come out," he said. He did not say her name. His voice was steady in the way a voice is steady when it is being held that way by force. "Come out, girl, whatever you are now." Come out, she did not come out. She felt the warm stone under her hand, and she felt the wood cat slip back against her ankle, and she watched her uncle stand alone in the small white flowers in the gathering dark, with his torch held up and his axe held low, and she felt something turn in her chest that was not fear. The trees at the edge of the clearing moved. She had seen wind in trees her whole life. This was not wind. The oaks leaned forward, and the leaning was deliberate, and the rustle of it was not the rustle of leaves, but the long, slow whisper of many voices, saying one word in a language she did not know, but somehow understood. The word was enough. Her uncle turned. He saw the leaning. He saw the trees moving against a wind that was not blowing. The axe came up. The torch came up. He took a step backward, and his boot caught on a root that had not been there a moment before. He fell. The root that had not been there a moment before closed around his ankle. A second root, thicker than her wrist, came up, out of the soil between two white flowers, and wrapped itself around his shovel hand. A third caught his shoulder. He did not scream. There was no time. He made a single short, hard sound, the kind of sound a man makes when the breath is knocked out of him. And then the moss beneath him softened the way the earth had softened above her own face the day before. And he sank into it the way a stone sinks into water, slow and final. The torch fell into the wet earth and went out. The clearing was quiet. The small white flowers closed their petals for the night, one by one, as though nothing had happened. She stood at the edge of the stone circle with her hand on the warm stone, and she did not move, and she did not look away. She watched until the last of the flowers had closed. She watched until the wood was still. Then she sat down on the moss inside the circle, and she put her face against her knees, and she did not cry, because she had used up her crying the day before. But she shook for a long time, the way a person shakes after a fever breaks. When she lifted her head, he was standing in the clearing. He had come back without a sound. The dark wings were folded. His face was very tired. "I did not do that," he said. "The wood did that, I want you to know." She looked at him. "I know," she said. He sat down beside her, not close, not far. "There is a price," he said. "The council has said it. You may stay in the wood, but you cannot leave it. Not now. Not in 10s, not in 100. The wood has tasted you, and the wood does not give back what it has tasted. If you stay, you will change. You will age more slowly. You will see things you did not see before. You will be one of the things the village whispers about, at the edge of the harvest fires. You will not be what you were." He paused. "Or," he said, "you may leave at first light. The wood will let you go, because I will ask it to. You will walk out of these trees and back into your village, and you will live the life you had. You will have your cottage. You will have your apple tree. But you will not come back here. You will not see me again, and the wood will not protect you from any second man with a shovel." He looked at her. "That is the price," he said. "The price is the choosing, and it is mine to offer, and yours to make." She did not answer for a long time. She watched a single late firefly drift across the inside of the stone circle and settle, briefly, on the back of her hand, and then lift again into the dark. She thought about the apple tree. She thought about Arnwen. She thought about the brown shawl her mother had woven. She thought about the small warm paw on her cheek, and the leaning of the oaks and the corner of his mouth when she had said, "You're the one with feathers." She thought about who she had been at dawn the day before, and she thought about who she had been at dusk the day before, and she understood that the girl who had walked into the wood with her uncle had not walked back out of the grave. Someone else had come up out of the dirt. Someone else was sitting on the moss now, deciding. "I want one thing first," she said. "Tell me. I want to walk to the edge of the wood at dawn. I want to leave something on the path where it will be found. Not my body, not a note, just a thing one person in the village will know, so that she knows I am not dead, so that she knows the wood took me, so that she does not spend the rest of her life thinking she should have asked one more question." He was quiet for a moment. "Who, Anwen Marrow?" He nodded slowly. "She has left honey at the edge of these trees for 50 years, he said. "The wood will not mind." She drew a slow breath. She felt the cold of the dirt leave her chest. Finally, for the first time since dawn the day before, she felt something else move into the space where the cold had been. "Then I will stay," she said. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he did something he had not done before. He lifted one hand, slowly, and he laid his fingertips, very lightly, against her temple. The way a person checks a fever, the way a person blesses a child, the way a person makes a promise without words. His fingertips were cool. They smelled faintly of crushed mint. She closed her eyes. When she opened them, he had taken his hand away, but he had not moved back. He was sitting close enough now that she could see the small, dark patterns on the inside of his wing, where the feathers met the skin. She had not seen those patterns before. She did not think anyone had seen those patterns in a very long time. "Tomorrow," he said, "I will walk you to the edge of the wood." "Tomorrow," she agreed. The firefly came back. The small wood cat returned and lay down across her feet. Somewhere beyond the stones an owl asked a question of the dark and was answered. At dawn, come beside him through the wood. The trees parted for them in ways she did not yet have language for. At the edge of the trees, at the place where the old path from the village ended and the wild began. She stopped. She took off the small silver locket she had worn under her dress since she was 15. Her mother's locket. The only thing of her mother's, her uncle had not been able to sell. She laid it carefully on the moss at the side of the path. She stepped back into the trees. She did not look back at the village. She had nothing to look at there. Across 3 fields, in a stone cottage at the south end of the same village, an old woman named Anwen Marrow was already awake. She had not slept easily in 2 nights. Not since the moment she had told a man in her kitchen that there had never been a grey shawl in that house. Something in her had been listening since then, and she did not know for what. At first light she put on her boots. She walked, the way she did every morning, to the edge of the old wood with a small jar of honey to leave on the moss. She did not know why she did this. Her mother had done it. Her grandmother had done it. It was a thing the women of her family had done since before there was a village. She found the locket on the moss beside the path. She knelt down. She picked it up. She held it in her palm for a long, long moment. She did not weep. She had not wept since her husband died. She closed her fingers around the locket, and she looked into the trees, and she said very softly, to whatever was listening, "Thank you." The oaks of the old wood moved once, all together, in a wind that was not blowing anywhere else. Iselle Calder walked into the wood with a man who meant to bury her, and she walked out of it as someone the wood would not give back. If there has ever been a person in your own life who watched too long without speaking up, or someone who finally did and changed everything, sit with that for a moment before you scroll on. Stories like this one are easier with company in the room. Subscribe if you want to be in the room for the next one. And underneath the story, leave the smallest thing a stranger ever did for you that you have never been able to repay.